Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Coaching the Bible. This is Season 5, Episode 1, number 214 overall. I know it's a couple of days late, just the way the schedule worked and the calendar worked, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity to dive into the beginning of the book of Genesis for the fifth time, particularly the story of the snake and Adam and Eve in the garden and the fruit. Our topic this week is on obedience, influence, ambition, and integrity. We're going to change things up a little bit this year. We're going to try our best to do series of subjects, get away a little bit from the weekly portion when possible, if possible. Look at other characters from throughout the Old Testament, throughout the Bible. Really go deep on their leadership, on their coachability, and perhaps more than anything else, their decision making. I've spent a lot of time over the last year looking and studying and reading about decision making, how people make decisions, what decisions they make, what are the factors and the inputs that go into those decisions. And I want to bring some of that out in Coaching the Bible. And so this series, this part of the series is called Indecision. Partially because the person is in the process of making a decision, and partially because the person is not sure what the decision should be or what the decision should be made. And so I wanted to do a deep dive this week into the entire story in the Garden of Eden and that whole story with the snake, with the fruit, with Adam and Eve, and how that worked out. And so let's dive in, because this story is, I think, a profoundly human story. Maybe it's what you might call the first story there in the Bible. And it's often seen as simply a story about temptation and disobedience. But there is a lot more that's going on beneath the surface that makes it an incredibly human story. It's a story about influence, it's a story about ambition, it's a story about loyalty, it's about boundaries, and it's about inner struggle. In essence, this story is about the choices we make and then the decisions we act upon. As the quote from Jean Paul Sartre goes, "We are our choices." It's as simple as that. Each character, the snake, Eve, Adam, and God, represents something unique. Each of them faces dilemmas that test their motives, their values, and their identities. Today, we're not just going to read about their choices. We're going to feel the weight of those choices, the uncertainties, the stakes, and the fears. And as we explore each character, I want you to ask yourself, where do I see myself in their stories? Could I have made a different choice? Would I have made a different choice? And if it's true that I would have made a different choice, on what factors am I making that choice and am I making that decision? So let's spend the time in each one of these different characters and let's go deep. And let's understand their decision making and all the things that go therein. This is going to be perhaps a little bit longer than usual, and I do want your feedback and your input as to how you thought this went, how you felt this worked for you, what questions it raised for you, what thoughts it raised for you, what issues it raised for you. And so let's begin with the snake. I want you to picture the snake in the garden. The snake is more than just a creature. It's an agent of doubt. It's an agent of change. The snake is deeply aware of how things work in Eden. Snake watches the peaceful, obedient world around it, and the snake watches it with, I think, great dissatisfaction. To the snake, everyone here seems almost blindly compliant. In our sort of development of each character, let's give a little bit of poetic license. Let's appreciate perhaps some of the circumstances that surround the beginning of that chapter, chapter 3 in the book of Genesis. And it opens with the snake, but let's give a little bit of color, a little bit of flavor, a little bit of depth. The snake sees Eden and sees the harmony of the garden as maybe stifling or lifeless. And maybe it senses an opportunity to introduce something dynamic. Choices, questions, maybe even a path to awareness, if we want to assume that the snake has any sort of positive intention. But the snake's goal isn't simply troublemaking, which I think most people assume and know that it is. The snake is challenging the status quo. It sees the obedience in the garden as a form of blindness, maybe even a barrier to true freedom. For the snake, freedom isn't about following a rule. Freedom is about questioning the rule, testing the rule, pushing the boundaries that exist. In its eyes, true freedom comes when someone understands the risks and makes a choice with full awareness and not out of passive obedience. Think about that for just a minute. What the snake injects into the garden is some sort of a revolt. The garden is the garden. You have Adam, you have Eve, you have the animals. There's a sense of balance, a sense of harmony, a sense of equanimity that exists there. You might call it paradise. The snake might call it boring. And so what the snake brings is something new to the table. The sense of choice, the sense of decision, the sense of maybe thought and thinking and pros and cons and determining what the right path actually is, what the decision maybe should be. Let's look a little bit further with the snake. Think for a second why the snake talks to Eve and not Adam. The snake perhaps senses something in her, maybe a spark of curiosity that's missing in Adam. Maybe Adam's mind is steady. Maybe he's more rooted in stability and routine. Maybe he's comfortable in the obedience. Maybe because it's his relationship first with God that he has no issues, he has no questions, he has no doubts. He has no desire to upset the cart. Maybe Eve, on the other hand, has some sort of a hunger for knowledge and for understanding. Maybe she doesn't just want to follow. Maybe she wants to know why. And so the snake senses an opportunity. In psychology, this approach, the snake's approach, targeting someone with a natural openness to influence, which on some level I think Eve is known as, quote unquote, the foot in the door technique. By choosing Eve, the snake picks the person most likely to consider an alternative view, setting in motion a ripple effect that could reach Adam too. It's a very strategic and very smart play by the snake. If the snake approaches Adam, maybe the snake gets nowhere. By approaching Eve, who maybe is one step removed from the God relationship, who is a rib from the side of Adam, isn't exactly Adam. We'll talk more about her in just a couple of moments. Maybe he sees the approach and the opportunity with her. And as the snake approaches, the snake doesn't push or demand. Instead, the snake asks a simple question. Did God really say you would die? But it's not just a question. The snake is creating a wedge. It's planting a seed, perhaps sowing some doubt that disrupts the simplicity of the garden's rules. Think about it. Until that moment, there are no questions. Until that moment, there are no issues in the garden. When the sages talk about the idea that the snake is representative of the evil inclination, one can understand where that comes from. If one understands perhaps the version of the story that it's allegorical and the snake isn't real, but it's operating inside the minds of Adam and Eve, then maybe Eve is more susceptible to something like this. Suddenly, once the question is raised, Eve feels something new. There's a tension between what she's always known, and what might be possible. The snake knows this feeling well. It's called cognitive dissonance, the discomfort we feel when our beliefs clash with new ideas. By introducing doubt, the snake doesn't force Eve to do anything. It simply makes her feel that something has been left unexamined. But the snake's manipulation actually goes even deeper. With confidence, it assures her, you will surely not die. Instead, you will be like God, knowing good and evil. This statement is delivered with a level of certainty and surety that makes the idea of disobedience feel not only tempting, but safe, even empowering. Psychologists would call this authority bias, a tendency to trust statements delivered with confidence. We've all seen this before. Someone is speaking an outright lie, something that is completely 100% not true, and we know it, but because of the manner in which they say it, the authority in which it's delivered, it sows the seed of doubt in our minds. The snake uses this bias to make Eve feel that eating the fruit isn't just safe, It might actually be wise. But let's take it a little bit further. What's at stake for the snake? Say that a few times. It sounds like it's right out of Dr. Seuss. If Eve eats, it introduces a new way of thinking to the garden, a world where rules aren't absolute, where choices have layers of meaning. The snake then isn't just tempting her, it's offering her, maybe dangerously, but some sort of an awakening, a chance to see beyond the obedience of the rules that are already in place. For the snake, this isn't just a test, it's an act of transformation. It's incredibly powerful. Let's reflect for a minute before we move on to Eve. How often do we encounter influences that create subtle doubt? Not absolute or abject doubt, but subtle doubts in our minds. When we make a decision, are we always aware of what's pushing us in one direction or another? What are the things that are driving at us? The snake shows us that influence doesn't have to be loud or forceful. Sometimes a single question can change everything. Once there's a wedge, there is space. And once there is space, there's the opportunity or the risk and the danger of choosing differently. That's what the snake represents in this story. That's character one. Character two is Eve, because Eve is the one that the snake is speaking to. Let's turn to Eve then. Step into her shoes for just a minute here. She appears to be curious, perhaps even restless to a degree, drawn to the mysteries of the world around her. While Adam might see the rules of the garden as a structure that keeps them safe, maybe Eve feels them as a barrier to her understanding. She has questions, a deeper inner pull towards knowledge that goes beyond simple obedience. The fruit represents something much more than food. It's a promise of wisdom, a path to see as God sees. That's not something small. That's not some sort of just pure curiosity. And it's not something that we should take lightly, the desire to see what God sees, the desire to see from God's perspective, even the desire maybe to have the power of a God. When the snake speaks, Eve's inner conflict begins to surface. What did God really say? Until now, the commands seemed to have been straightforward and unquestioned, but now her mind is now open to a possibility that God might have reasons for keeping this knowledge from them, reasons she wants to understand, things she hadn't thought about before. The snake hints that by eating the fruit, she would gain knowledge like God's. The potential to be like God, quote unquote, awakens something powerful in Eve, a feeling of purpose, of growth, of seeing beyond her current limits. It would seem like a good opportunity. It would seem like something somebody might jump at. But let's remember, the stakes here are incredibly high. Eating this fruit isn't just breaking a rule. It's stepping away from the innocence. It's stepping into the unknown. Eve risks losing her connection to God, her place in the Garden of Eden, and probably her relationship with Adam. She would appear to be aware of these risks, but perhaps those risks at this moment feel a little bit distant. What stands out most to her in this moment is the chance to expand her understanding to become something more than she currently is. She is not Adam. She is different. Again, even though she is a rib from his side, we know that the personalities, take it, of identical twins are not the same. And so even though this person is plucked and pulled and ripped out of the side of Adam, she's not him. And so here we see something that's called consequence discounting at play. This is, as opposed to where we talked about authority bias, this is a cognitive bias where we focus on the immediate reward and downplay the long-term cost. We all do this. Imagine a situation in your life. A critical project is due tomorrow, but a friend invites you out tonight. So the idea of fun now overshadows the risk of facing the fallout later. We perhaps all did this as kids or in school. We had to study, but there was a game on. We wanted to watch the game. And so watching the game with our friends was immediate excitement and joy and pleasure. And we discount the consequence that is later on. So for Eve, the distance The distant consequence of exile is almost invisible when weighed against the immediate promise of wisdom. Think about it for just a moment. What she sees right in front of us is this incredibly desirable fruit, and everything else is clouded out, minimally blurred, but certainly pushed to the periphery and beyond of what she can actually see. Her ambition makes her incredibly vulnerable. She doesn't just want more, she wants to break free of limits, to test the boundaries placed around her. Yet her ambition blinds her to the true cost. She's sacrificing obedience and potentially her relationships, all for the chance to know. It's a powerful but flawed decision, and it's driven by what we might call a hyperbolic level of discounting, where immediate rewards overshadow the delayed consequences, even though these consequences are enormous. Eve is both courageous and at the same time tragically short-sighted. So let's consider this. Where we talked about the snake before, let's think about this from the perspective of Eve. Have you ever been so focused on a goal that you ignored what it might cost you in the future? Are you so driven by an ambition that the risks seem minor or irrelevant? I'm pretty sure we've all felt that. So in a moment, we've all felt the space of where the snake is. We've also felt the space of where Eve is. Eve's choice shows the dual nature of ambition. It can drive us to growth, but can also lead us into decisions we may and likely will regret later on. So that's two parts of this story. That takes us to Adam. So while Eve is drawn by curiosity, I think Adam's heart is rooted in loyalty, stability, and unity. He embodies the obedience to the boundaries and the rules of the garden that are set up by God. He values the structure that the Garden of Eden provides, the harmony that comes from following God's command, the balance that exists between man and animal. But then Eve eats the fruit. And in that moment, Adam faces a choice he never expected. Suddenly, he's torn between two deep commitments, his loyalty to God and his love for his wife, for Eve. This is the ultimate in choices and decisions and indecisions that a person has. Imagine the inner conflict. Imagine that the what's going on inside Adam, just ripping him apart in that moment before he eats the fruit. You know the end, so the curse of knowledge is at play here because we know what he does. But as you're reading the text, stop in the space between the verse where she eats and the verse where he eats, and consider the conflict that Adam faces. He desperately wants to stay true to God's command, but he also can't bear the thought of losing Eve. Because the truth is, once she eats the fruit and he doesn't, they're not on the same playing field anymore. They're not operating in the same space, the same sphere. They don't have the same life anymore. They're not a partnership in that space. They're not united any longer. At the moment, before she eats, they are partners, bound together in every part, in every aspect of their life. Once she eats, and he maybe makes the decision not to, he's now going to abandon her, facing isolation, a kind of spiritual separation that perhaps he fears very deeply. Adam's risk isn't just about breaking a rule. It's about losing his connection with both God and with Eve. The turmoil he must feel in that moment when she comes to him having eaten the fruit. What should he do? His loyalty to God, his loyalty to his wife, his loyalty to the rules, his loyalty to his relationship with his spouse, eternity in the garden, eternity with his wife. So this is where an additional psychological issue might come in, which is called loss aversion. In psychology, loss aversion is the tendency to prefer avoiding loss over gaining something new. Avoiding loss over gaining something new. Adam's fear of losing Eve outweighs his fear of losing his place in Eden. This fear drives his decision-making. I think this is one approach that we can attach ourselves to because It's very human and very much something that we would connect to. He tells himself, perhaps, that staying with Eve is good enough to justify breaking God's command, a decision that reflects something that's called satisficing. Satisficing means choosing an option that's good enough rather than choosing the ideal, a choice that keeps things together, but at a cost to one's deeper values. Imagine a time for yourself when you've gone along with someone's decision just to avoid conflict. Maybe that's a partner, maybe that's with a friend, maybe that's with a spouse, maybe that's with a team or a boss. You went along with it, you thought it was wrong, you knew it was wrong, you knew the risk, you knew the danger, you maybe even knew the consequence, but to avoid the risk, to avoid the conflict, you made a choice. So Adam's choice isn't his best choice, but it's one he makes out of a need for unity. He sacrifices his own principles to stay close to Eve, even though he knows the cost is high. He knows the risk. He knows the consequence of eating that fruit. And in doing so, he loses a part of himself. He loses his integrity. He loses his sense of obedience to God. He loses maybe his sense of responsibility. And then, therefore, at the end, his sense of accountability. It is a heartbreaking compromise, a choice he makes in love, but at a painful cost to his soul. So reflect on this. Whereas before we saw ourselves in the snake and we saw ourselves in Eve, can we also see ourselves in Adam? How often have we compromised our values to keep the peace with someone we love? Are there times when we choose unity over integrity? And what does that actually cost us in the long run? Adam's decision shows us that loyalty, while powerful, can sometimes lead us away from our own truth. Three characters in an incredibly gut-wrenching and difficult and painful, conflicting story, and we see ourselves in every single one of them. And now the fourth player in the story is God. So let's turn to God. God's role here isn't about temptation or punishment. It's about creating the framework that makes freedom and responsibility possible. I want you to think of God as the guide who knows that freedom only has value when paired with responsibility. Freedom only has value when paired with responsibility. The commandment, do not eat from this tree, isn't just a restriction. It's a boundary that allows Adam and Eve to make a meaningful choice. Meaning, if God decides not to set the boundary, then they can eat from everything. If they're not aware of the possibility of the tree, there's no conflict. If there's no limit set or no boundary established, then there's nothing that's tugging at them that might be viewed as loss, as conflict, as discomfort for them. Now, God, of course, is aware of the risk in setting this boundary. By allowing Adam and Eve free will, God knows that disobedience is, in fact, a possibility. By putting a tree in the garden that they cannot eat from, God sets up the possibility of disobedience. This choice then means they might bring pain and separation into the world. But without this risk, their choices wouldn't carry any meaning. The boundary gives them the chance to understand consequences and accountability and to grow as moral beings. God's decision-making, though, is different than Adam, Eve, and the snake. It's what's called deontological. I'll spell that one for you. Deontological. Deontological. Valuing rules as inherently good. The command to not eat from the tree isn't about control. It's about giving Adam and Eve a framework for growth. Sometimes we look at these things as limits, and sometimes they're boundaries. And sometimes the limits in our lives and the boundaries in our lives actually are the things that allow us to grow, that give us the space to blossom. When they break the rule, God responds with both justice and mercy. They're exiled, but they're also clothed. It's a level of what you might call restorative justice, a balance between accountability and compassion, allowing them to face their actions with dignity. Imagine the significance of God's boundaries. We have many of them, many strictures, many commandments, many rules, many limits in place. Without them, Adam and Eve wouldn't have the chance to experience meaningful freedom. Boundaries are like a foundation. They create the space where choices can carry real weight. These limits, though, aren't about restriction. They're about creating a world where choices lead to growth and where mistakes lead to learning. So let's reflect then on God's position here. What boundaries in our lives help us make meaningful choices? How do limits create spaces where freedom and responsibility coexist? Think about your love relationships, your communal relationships, your professional relationships, and the limits that you set in those relationships, in those settings, in those communities that allow you to grow and to expand and to blossom and to bear fruit and to accomplish and to succeed and to do all kinds of things that without those strictures in place, you might get nowhere. God's boundaries, therefore, show us that setting limits isn't about control. It's really about fostering growth where freedom has value and mistakes lead to wisdom. And so each character, the snake, Eve, Adam, and God, offer us a profound lesson. And so summary, let's look at them. The snake is very much about subtle influence. The snake teaches us that sometimes a simple question can create doubt, and subtle influence can shift our choices in powerful ways. Eve is very much about ambition and maybe perhaps short-sightedness. Eve's choice shows us that ambition, while motivating, can also blind us to long-term risk. Loyalty versus integrity is Adam. Adam's struggle reminds us that loyalty, while valuable, can sometimes lead us to compromise on our deepest values. And God is about boundaries and growth. God's boundaries reveal that rules are more than restrictions. They are foundations for meaningful freedom and growth. And then let's think about this practically for ourselves. What influences in your life are shaping your decisions? How do you become more aware of those influences? How much time do you consider, not just about the decisions that you make, but in the process by which you make those decisions? The inputs, the influences, the biases that exist that go into your decision-making processes. The things that help you make decisions, and the things that stop you or hold you up or create indecision in your mind. What ambitions are you pursuing at this very moment that might have unforeseen costs? How are you weighing the short-term benefits against the long-term consequences? Do you do the work, the exercise to appreciate the pro-con, the case for, the case against what it is that you're doing? We've talked a lot about coaching with the Bible with the first level, the second level, the third level. The Adam piece here. Is there a relationship that you're currently in where you're compromising your values? Where you're not in balance with your integrity? Where there's an incongruence between what you believe and what you feel and what you're doing? And how do you get that back? These are profound questions. This is not even in the space of the punishment that's meted out, or the consequences that's meted out, in terms of actually being tossed out of the garden, the punishment that Eve gets, the punishment that the snake gets, the punishment that Adam has. This is simply just in the moment, in the story, in the space where it happens, appreciating the depth and the pain and the promise and the possibility of the choices that are to be made and that which is introduced by this situation. These choices, these lessons, these decisions are not just of the ancient world. They speak very much to the lives we live today. Think about your choices. As we just came out of the holiday season, we're sort of now jumping into the winter of the year. As I've said, there's so much going on around us, and we have to consider it. We have to explore it. We have to live it. But at the same time, we can plan for certain things. We can be ready for other things, and we can produce maybe differently this time than last time. And when we find ourselves in a situation where a snake is presenting a fruit to us, is it a boundary? Is it a limit? Is it something that's going to set us up for success, for failure, for decision, for indecision, for freedom, for some form of slavery, for openness and expansion, or for being held back? I think that's why this story is first. Before we get to accountability and responsibility with consequence, this is an incredibly human story. And I think it's one that we have to explore even further. I think there's more here that we didn't get into in the 30 minutes that we just spent together on this story. I invite you to share your thoughts with me on this. I'm curious to hear how you see and feel and think about the snake, about Adam, about Eve, about their roles, about their decision-making processes, about the different psychological ideas that we talked about herein, about loyalty, disloyalty, about decision-making, about indecision-making, about integrity, about all those things as we continue to go forward in coaching with the Bible. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Again, I really do look forward to your input, your insights, your comments, your critiques for me. And I look forward to seeing you next week or this week, later this week, for the episode 215 as we explore Noah. Have a great week.